Thank you so much for joining us for this special online Zoom event in celebration of the 50th anniversary of Walsall's Garman Ryan Collection. So my name is Julie and I work at the New Art Gallery Walsall, where I manage the publicly owned art collections. Just letting a few more people in. So I'm just going to 5 minutes just giving a bit of a rundown of the background and the context to this event night before introducing our speaker. So the Garman Ryan Collection was donated in 1973 by Kathleen Garman. If I could get my slide to change. It's on a bit of a go slow. There we are. Here's Kathleen Garman on the right, so otherwise known as Lady Kathleen Epstein, being the widow of renowned 20th century sculptor Jacob Epstein, who is on the left of the photograph.
I've got it.
Can people see the screen okay? The slide?
Yep, I can see it, Julie.
Oh, thank you. Okay, still people coming in a bit late. So this important collection had been created after Epstein's death in 1959 and was to be the legacy not only of Kathleen Garman and her extraordinary circle of friends and family, but also of the little-known American sculptor, Sally Ryan. My slides are a bit slow. They're playing catch-up. But you will see her in a second. She was born Sarah Tack Ryan, named after her mother. Sally, most sometimes as well. Sally had a short life, which was marred by illness in later years. So, as well as works by Epstein, of course, and by family members and close associates such as Lucian Freud and Matthew Smith, there are artworks which Sally bequeathed to Kathleen. And also these included many works by Sally themselves. And the gallery now has what is believed to be the largest and only collection of Sally's work in a public institution. However, very little has been known about Sally's life and background. And the collection at Walsall has very much been viewed through the Garman family perspective. It was Kathleen Garman who donated the collection during their lifetime, and their estate, who now we liaise with often. We knew that Sally was the granddaughter of American multimillionaire Thomas Fortune Ryan, himself an esteemed art collector, and who commissioned this bust of himself by Rodin. This version is in the collection of the V&A. So Sally inherited their wealth from their grandfather and maybe their taste in it as well. Sally was openly gay, had short hair and wore traditionally masculine clothes and aspired to sort of a different sort of life than the rest of their wealthy socialite family from whom they were somewhat estranged. We also know that they travelled extensively between Europe and North America, and first arriving in London at the age of 18 when they exhibited this stunning La Martinique at the Royal Academy. So this is, it's seen here currently on display at the New Art Gallery. And it was at this time that they became acquainted with Epstein and Kathleen and became firm friends for the rest of their lives. And Epstein made this bust of Sally, aged 21, in 1937. In this year that we found out through Art UK that Sally was commissioned to make a sculpture of the head of BBC radio drama, Val Gielgud, which is now in the small art collection that the BBC has. Alongside is a work in our collection of Geoffrey Vickers, so a celebrated systems analyst, and he received a VC following service in World War I and was later knighted after the Second World War. And this is in our collection, so we know that she studied and was commissioned to make busts of some celebrated British figures. But also there are many unknown sitters, people that we didn't know in the collection. We know Somerset Maugham, of course, and we have the plaster for a sculpture by Somerset Maugham, but we didn't know where the bronzes were. And this is currently on display. Next to Valentina, again, someone that we didn't know the identity of. And we also have other sculptures by Sally, if my screen would catch up, Nathaniel as well, which is a very popular sculpture in our collection. Here it is currently on display. And these heads, not currently on display, but of unknown sitters as well. In the 50s, due to Sally's poor health, she turned to painting, sculpture being too physical for her. And so we identify these paintings as being from the 1950s period that are in the collection. One of our most favourite artworks is the Cutting Garden, Connecticut from 1960. It's one of the most popular and was voted for by several people in our current 50 favourites for 50 years exhibition. So it's a beautiful painting. And Sally had wanted to kind of be good at painting as well as sculpture. So she definitely achieved that in her later years. She also did a portrait of Kathleen, which captures her quite well. And this is the only photograph of Sally and Kathleen that we have together in our archives, and it's currently on display at the moment as well. So we have a small amount of archive materials relating to Sally, but not as much as you might think, considering they put this collection together. Yeah, we might touch on later why we think that might be, but we do have copies of her will and some photographs, but not a great deal. And we've been in contact with some distant family members who've really been unable to kind of shed any light on where the rest of her artistic output may have been. This mysterious sort of presence in our collection has been inspiration for several contemporary artists in the 2010s. So both Sarah Taylor Silverwood and Grace Williams, West Midlands artists, kind of addressed their legacy in residencies that they held gallery. And most recently, Sally been inspiration for a Queering the Collections trail, celebrating her legacy and how queerness lies at the heart of our collection, including a series of contemporary artist interventions, performances and explorations into gender identity last year. So this year in 2023, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Garman Ryan Collection and continue to promote the juxtaposition of art from all periods, speaking to each other, as was the wish of Kathleen Garman for the collection, choosing for it to be displayed thematically rather than chronologically, ensuring that it continues to remain relevant to visitors today. So this is how it looks now. And fortuitously, earlier this year, our guest this evening introduced himself and got in contact to tell us that he was writing a biography of his great aunt. So it's at this point I would like to introduce, and let's see if I can spotlight David Goldbloom. So if I stop sharing, I think everyone is in now. People were coming in throughout that part. So can I spotlight you for everyone? Yes, I can. So good afternoon. It's lunchtime in Toronto.
Well, it's almost tea time, actually, but
tea time.
It's definitely still sunny outside.
Well, it's very dark here in Birmingham. But let me try to introduce you properly to try and do you some justice, which I don't know that I can, but you are a semi-retired professor of psychiatry, but seem to be as busy as ever. You were senior medical advisor at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. You are a scholar from who studied at Harvard, a Rhodes Scholar alongside Bill Clinton, no less. And
well, he's older than I am. I was a couple of years after him.
But still rubbing shoulders with. I've seen the proof. I've seen the photos. You were chair of the Medical Health Commission in Canada. You're officer of the Order of Canada and a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. So, you know, we're in very esteemed company this evening. But you were at pains to point out that you're not a professor of art history, and you're worried that people might be expecting that. But
yes, they may be severely disappointed.
No, but
I'm not
what a
an
perfect
expert in
person
art
to
history.
write someone's biography. And so, yeah, can you tell us how it's come about that you're writing a biography, who your great aunt was, and their connection with Sally, and how you've been able to help us shed new light on our collection in its 50th anniversary year?
Sure.
So, yeah.
Well, first of all, Julie, thank you for having me on this webcast, and hello to everybody who has tuned in. I've been so appreciative of the help provided by the new art gallery Walsall, and I had a chance to spend a full day there to meet Julie, to meet Stephen Snoddy, and to really get a sense of just what a wonderful place it is. If people haven't been there, I encourage them to go there. Anyway, let me begin by saying why I had this intersect with the work and life of Sally Ryan. My great aunt was a concert pianist in Canada who performed in the United States, the United Kingdom, Western Europe, and South America. And her name was Ellen Ballon.
This meeting is being recorded.
Ballon. Ellen Ballon is now almost completely forgotten as a figure in classical music, even though prior to the emergence of Glenn Gould as Canada's greatest pianist, she was perhaps the best known of all Canadian pianists before then. And so I felt that her life was not only an interesting and important one, but one whose story deserved to be told. And I knew that she had been in a long-term relationship with Sally Ryan from the mid-1930s until the late 1950s. They lived openly together, they traveled together, but the nature of their relationship was kept somewhat under wraps. And although they lived openly together, the idea that they were a lesbian couple was not discussed openly by family, was certainly not mentioned in the media, even though they had a large gay cohort of friends among artists and writers and musicians. And even though they were involved, in fact, in a three-way relationship with a Canadian poet by the name of Ralph Gustafson, also now a largely forgotten figure, but who lived with and traveled with Sally and Ellen for a couple of decades. And so that's what brought me into the world of Sally Ryan. My family had inherited, in the wake of Ellen's death and then her husband's death, a number of pieces of art, both paintings and sculpture, by Sally. So I was familiar with those. But it's only when I started to seriously approach the issue of the biography of Ellen Ballon that my research on Sally Ryan brought me all the way north of Birmingham to Walsall and to the new art gallery there. Now, the picture you're looking at on your screen is of Ellen Ballon in the mid-1930s when she and Sally were living together in Lisle Mews, a rather fashionable address in London, and the portrait photographer Pearl Freeman took the picture you see on the left. On the right, the portrait is by Yusuf Karsh, who was not only Canada's greatest portrait photographer, but also really one of the world's great portrait photographers. His portrait of Churchill in the 1940s is one of the most famous of his images. I don't know if you want to move on to another slide. There we see, and maybe people, yeah, I'm wondering if people could mute their microphones so that, thank you. Here are three portraits of Ellen. The one on the left is a bust by Sally done in the mid-1930s that was part of her first ever exhibition at the Cooling Galleries in London, her one-man show, their one-person show. In the middle is a bust of Ellen that's an unusual one, as you see the outstretched hands reaching for an invisible piano. And this was by Sir Jacob Epstein in the late 1930s, and another society photograph of Ellen in some white fur stole, again by Pearl Freeman of London. It reflects the fact that Ellen had a musical career, but also a social career. And she was very caught up with being a member of high society at the very same time that Sally Ryan was caught up with avoiding what she called cafe society. And as you pointed out earlier, Julie, Tammy was, or Sally, as she was more commonly known, was born into a family whose wealth was generated initially by her grandfather, Thomas Fortune Ryan, who was at the time of his death the 10th wealthiest man in the United States, having made his many millions by owning the majority of streetcars and streetcar tracks in New York City, by owning a life insurance company, building everything from typewriters to submachine guns, and collaborating with King Leopold II in the mining of diamonds in the Belgian Congo. Some of his partners in those exercises were also people who left their names to the world of art. Harry Payne Whitney, as in the Whitney Museum, and Daniel Guggenheim, as in the Guggenheim Museum. And her grandfather, as you pointed out, had his bust done by Auguste Rodin. But he also built an enormous private art gallery next to his house on Fifth Avenue. And he had extraordinary works of art in that. But Sally, his granddaughter, had another artistic connection. Her mother, who was a Philadelphia debutante named Sarah Tack, had a brother, Augustus, and Augustus Tack was a noted American landscape painter who also played a role in fostering the careers of great modern American painters such as Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock. So a legacy for Sally of both collecting and valuing art and also creating and inspiring art. And she, like the other grandchildren of Thomas Ryan, received an inheritance on the death of Thomas Ryan in 1928. At the time of his death, he left an estate of about $200 million. And in 1928, that amount would be equivalent today to well north of $3 billion US dollars, a sizable estate. He did cut Sally's father out of the will for reasons I can get into if you're interested, but he didn't cut out the grandchildren. And so they inherited the money after Sally's parents went through a very melodramatic divorce that was newspaper headlines in New York when it happened due to accusations of adultery. And it was not long after that that Sally's mother and Sally's siblings, there were 6 children in total, moved to Montreal and really cemented a strong connection between the Ryan family and, in particular, the province of Quebec. Sally began sculpting at around age 15 or 16 and was already exhibiting some of her work under an assumed name. And when she graduated high school in Montreal, she went to Paris briefly to attend finishing school, but had no interest in it, dropped out, studied with the French sculptor Jean Camus, and then in the mid-1930s moved to London. And she had the opportunity to attend the open houses that Sir Jacob Epstein held at his Hyde Park studios on Saturdays. And she met him, she became his pupil, and she ultimately became his patron. He was profoundly influential on her style, but as you can see in a series of letters which I have from Epstein to Sally, who by then was going not by Sally, but by Tammy. And I should point out, Tammy was a bit of a compromise name. What she really preferred to be called, and what my father knew her as, was Tim. And maybe that was a little too bluntly masculine for some, and Tammy was a compromise. But by the late 1930s, Tammy was no longer simply Epstein's main student. She was also his patron. And she purchased his massive sculpture, Madonna and Child, for about $7,500 US. Now you see in these letters, letters of great distress from Epstein importuning Tammy to please support him financially. And she did so. She was generous toward him. She bought the Madonna and Child, but then she gave it on loan to the Tate Gallery, and then it was in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And then in 1960, she donated it to Riverside Church in New York, where it resides now. But she did provide him with a great deal of financial support. Interestingly, early reviews of her work pointed out the similarity of her work to Epstein's, and reviewers hoped that she would move beyond that to evolve her own style. Now, in the previous slide, you see a maquette of a bust that Tammy did of Epstein. Here is that maquette. As you can see, it was a small maquette. If there was a cast made or a larger sculpture made, I have no idea where it is. There are relatively few pictures of Tammy and Ellen together, but the one you see on the right was likely from the mid-1950s. Ellen is on the left, Tammy is on the right, and they are on either side, obviously, of Sir Jacob Epstein. But certainly Epstein was very familiar with Ellen, and messages to her appear repeatedly in his letters, but he knew that it was Tammy who was going to be his principal benefactor. Now, Tammy continued her sculpting after she and Ellen left England. They left England in 1938 as war loomed. They left Lyle Muse and moved to New York City. Because of the kind of financial resources at her disposal, Sally purchased residences at 2 Central Park West in Manhattan, overlooking Central Park at the corner of 67th Street. These were magnificent apartments, 2-story apartments with a 2-story picture window in each of them overlooking Central Park. Although they were in separate apartments, my understanding is that there was a door connecting the bedrooms. And Sally used her living room as a sculpture studio. Ellen had her living room as a piano studio with her Steinway sitting in it. And I was in that apartment in 1969, the only time I was there, to help clear it out. And it was a spectacular residence. Now on the right, you see Sally in her typical garb, which was sort of men's gabardine trousers, men's shoes, and a heavy overcoat, working on a bust, a statue of Jesus. And this was in the early 1940s in New York. And she used a New York publicity man who she met at a party, a Christmas party, as a model for Jesus in this particular sculpture. She sculpted many famous individuals, one of whom was the great Black actor, vocalist, political activist, Paul Robeson. Now, I'll say something about Robeson in a moment, but in this slide, you see Val Gielgud on the right, who was head of BBC Radio Drama. And that bust is well known to the Garman Ryan Collection. What's less well known is the bust on the left, which is part of the Goldbloom collection. It's owned by my brother. And it is a bust of John Gielgud as Hamlet in the 1930s, John Gielgud being Val Gielgud's brother. The bust and the person standing next to his likeness is John Rothenstein, who, in my view, looks as hilarious as the bust. I had no idea. I had many photographs of the bust as well as this picture of the bust with the subject, but I had no idea who either was until I got to the Garman Ryan Collection and Stephen Snoddy told me who John Rothenstein was. And so I think in that regard, we've been helpful to each other with my private collection and their collection in making these identities known to each other. And this slide illustrates it perfectly. Here you see Sally reading and smoking, two of her common vocations. And the smoking I really do have to comment on. Her grandfather was the founder of the British American Tobacco Company, among his many business ventures. Sally was a heavy smoker throughout her life, and in her early 40s developed a carcinoma of the larynx, almost surely a complication of her smoking, and died a decade later. But behind her is her striking bust of Paul Robeson, done in the 1930s. And here is the connection with Ellen Ballon. Ellen Ballon and Paul Robeson spent a year touring the United Kingdom together in concert and became very close friends. I have a signed picture from Robeson to Ellen describing himself as her ardent admirer. And this was, I think, quite striking at a time that white and black performers were not often touring together. Paul Robeson played Othello on Broadway and then in the West End. And his kiss with Desdemona was the first ever interracial kiss on a Broadway stage. His performance as Othello remains the longest-running Shakespeare play ever to grace a Broadway stage. Robeson remained throughout the 40s and 50s very close to Ellen's extended family in Montreal. My parents remember him very well coming to Friday night dinners at my grandparents' home. And when my great-grandfather, Ellen Ballon's father, was on his deathbed, Robeson was in town and held his hand and sang him Hebrew and Yiddish spirituals while he lay in bed. Now, on the right is a picture of Tammy, or Sally, in her New York studio with just the lower end of that massive two-story picture window. And to the right of her is the Martinique. Let me say a word about the Martinique, because this was her most famous sculpture that really launched her career, winning awards in Paris and London in the 1930s. And when I saw the Martinique, when I walked in to the New Art Gallery, Walsall, I immediately recognized it because a cast of it had been sitting in my parents' home here in Canada for the last 50 years. It now is in my sister's home now that my parents have died. And my father had told me many years ago that the subject of the Martinique, unknown to the people at the Walsall Gallery, was in fact a maid of the family. And on top of that, one of the other most valued sculptures was Nathaniel, a beautiful black boy, also a sculptor in our family for half a century, and now with my sister's daughter. And this was indeed the son of the Martinique. So it's wonderful to know that these works of art, which stand on their own in terms of their artistic quality, also have a very personal backstory to them. Now, this bust is of a woman named Valentina. Again, the name was known to the New Art Gallery of Walsall, but not the backstory. Valentina was a high-end dress designer who made Ellen Ballon's concert gowns. She was a character. She was an elegant woman from the Ukraine who had a dress studio in New York. Among her clients was Greta Garbo, the film actress, and she was rather circumspect about things like her date of birth, but she cut a very dashing figure and was very much part of the life of Ellen Ballon, for whom fashion was a high priority. She kept plaster casts of her feet at Ferragamo in Italy so that they could fashion new shoes for her when she needed them. And given that she was barely 5 feet tall, she needed shoes that elevated her. Here you see 3 depictions of Ellen by Sally, on the left being fitted for one of Valentina's gowns, in the middle at repose, and on the right a rather sort of sad or weary portrait of Ellen that I believe is from the 1950s. And these are not in a collection anywhere, they're in my home, along with a marvelous pen and ink sketch by Sally of Ellen recording the Villa-Lobos First Piano Concerto, a piece that Villa-Lobos wrote for Ellen. She gave the world premiere in Rio de Janeiro, in New York, Dallas, Toronto, Montreal, and then in London, England, with Sir Thomas Beecham conducting. She also recorded it for Decca. It was the only recording of the piece for many years, and it was her signature piece. There are pictures of Sally and, of course, Ralph Gustafson, the poet, and the third player in their triangle, all together with Villa-Lobos in Rio de Janeiro in 1945, but there are no mentions of the nature of the relationships that existed among them. Sally not only created art, but she also sat for paintings. You see on the left, Edward Lintott, who was a prominent portrait artist in the UK, painted her. The rather wild Picasso colleague Emmanuel Manet-Katz, originally of Lithuania, hung out with Picasso in the 1920s in Paris, was a friend of Sally's, painted a rather unlikely depiction of her in the mid-1930s, and she became a significant collector of Manet-Katz's paintings subsequently, although they're mostly in a gallery now in Israel. And on the right is one of a couple of self-portraits by Sally. As Julie pointed out, as she became ill in the 1950s, she had turned to painting over sculpture because of the physical demands, but also because as an artist, she wanted to enter a new chapter in her life. And while she was satisfied with the quality of her sculpting, she was initially less satisfied with her painting and really wanted to focus on it and improve it. This is a picture from High Perch Farm. Let me say that when Sally and Ellen returned to New York in 1938, not only did Sally buy the apartments in New York, she bought a 113-acre estate in Redding, Connecticut, and named it High Perch Farm. This became a hangout not only for Ellen, Sally, and Ralph, but for a variety of artists, musicians, politicians, and other celebrated people, ranging from Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, to Somerset Maugham, who was a repeated visitor, to Manet-Katz, and to Fritz Reiner, the conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. It also provided inspiration for Sally to do some of her paintings. Her landscapes, her watercolors took root at High Perch Farm.
And gardening was a great love as well.
Gardening was indeed a passion of hers as well. And, you know, we have almost 10 years worth of home movies from High Perch Farm that frankly no one has seen in 50 years.
Yep.
And these have now been digitized. A copy is at the gallery, and it includes some footage which I think you're going to show, Julie.
Yes. Did you? And you have the guest book. This is how you know all of these esteemed.
Yes, everybody,
including your father.
Including my father as a teenager, inscribing after a big meal there, what foods these morsels be, and other lines like that. People had a good time there, and it's reflected in all the inscriptions over a decade.
And this photograph was
yes, this is a photograph that is to my father, who she called Dickie, as did many people, to Dickie Dormouse, because he reminded her of the dormouse, and it's signed affectionately Tim.
Tim.
So you see on the left the cast, not the cast, but rather the plaster bust of Mom that exists in the new art gallery Walsall. And on the right, you see the cast that exists in my living room. It's the same bust.
Yes, and now we know where it is.
Right.
It's
Now,
amazing.
yeah, sadly, we know where some of the busts are, but many of her great busts, of which we have photographs, have disappeared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is the film that you were referring to. I'm just going to play the start of it to give people a sense of High Perch Farm. Can you see that okay, David?
Yes. And
Yeah.
now this is obviously a winter scene that doesn't allow you to see the large swimming pool and the tennis courts that
I think it shows us the excavation for that. And yeah, Sally was a great tennis player, wasn't she, as well?
She was. And when I was there once in 1969, there were Epstein busts dotting the landscape outdoors.
So I'll forward it to the bit that we talked about. Yeah, I should say that in the early 2000s, Betty Gustafsson donated some things to the archive. And now seeing this film, a lot of it makes sense. Oops, gone too far. I'm just trying to get the zooming ahead. So the sketches and things that they kind of interspersed with the footage. There's the swimming pool. And then we can see some of the travels that they went on together and the different recitals that they went on. And then here, if I can stop it around here, we can see the group including Somerset Mom. And if I maybe play about here, will that go? Where we want to go, hopefully, yes. And then you can actually see Sally in action sculpting.
Here we go. So this is really, truly rare footage of Mom on the left, sitting for his bust as Tammy works on it. And indeed, I have many letters from Somerset Maugham to Tammy and Ellen, many of them from his fabled home on Cap Ferrat in France.
And there's the bust of Ellen in the background.
Right. And I apologize for the quality, but these are 35 millimeter films transferred in the 1970s to video cassette, and now another 50 years later, digitized.
And they're in the Dalhousie archives of Ellen. Is that where you retrieved this?
No, this came in my journey around to various different places. This came from the archives of Ralph Gustafsson, because Ralph was the cinematographer for many of these home movies. And there's the artist Manet Katz on the right, goofing around with Tammy. You see his painting of Ellen behind them. And I have no idea where that painting is, but there's Manet Katz and Ellen together.
And do we see Sally's portrait? Or
I believe so.
Maybe missed it. So that's Ellen.
That would be Ellen. In any case, I think it gives you the flavor of a country place where people felt free and relaxed. At one point, Somerset Maugham was there with his male lover. And sadly, in a 1966 interview with a newspaper, Ellen professed shock and surprise had newspaper accounts of mom's gay life. And it's, I think, a reflection of the fact that while they felt free to live their lives remained closeted and private in terms of the public arena.
And so it was Ralph's family, maybe a nephew, that sort of saved this footage. This guy with the cat.
No, that fellow I don't think is his nephew, but no. I suspect it was one of his graduate students at the university where he taught.
And so you kind of have inherited various items of Ellen's and Sally's, because do you want to say a bit about that? Ellen sort of inherited 25%, didn't she, of Sally's estate?
So basically, when Sally died in 1968, she left all of her artwork that she had been gathering with Kathleen Garman to Kathleen to take care of. She left her real estate, which was considerable, and her residual estate to Ellen. She left nothing to her siblings because she felt they were already very well looked after. And that is the story of Sally's estate. One of the things that I have in my possession is a diary that Sally kept in the 1950s in the wake of her diagnosis of cancer. And Sally was a private person, although she was profiled in Life magazine and often written about as a kind of reluctant heiress in the newspapers, someone who eschewed all the trappings of her inherited wealth. She really did try to keep a low profile, but her private diary speaks to her struggles in relationships, her struggles to succeed as an artist, her feeling of a need to be alone in order to be creative. Now you see in this picture on the left, her bust that was unknown to the New Art Gallery Walsall, and unknown to me until I started doing research on the great American playwright and novelist Edna Ferber. And that is indeed a bust of Edna Ferber. Edna Ferber wrote the novel Showboat that became the hit musical and film. She also wrote the novel Giant that became a James Dean film. She was an extraordinarily successful playwright and novelist, a single woman, Jewish, living in New York, but also, like Ellen and Sally, having an estate in Connecticut and very much part of their circle. I've been in touch with her niece, who is also her biographer, and we have lots of evidence to suggest that Ellen and Edna Ferber were in an intimate relationship. So this was, again, part of that artist's circle that mirrors in some way the circle that Kathleen Garman and her siblings were in. If you read that marvelous book by Cressida Connolly, The Rare and the Beautiful, about the Garman family in England, they are intertwined with everybody from Vita Sackville West and Virginia Woolf to Augustus John and T.S. Eliot and Lucian Freud. They're all part of this nexus of artistic individuals and lots of affairs and relationships going on with a tremendous degree of fluidity. But I would say it's fluidity coupled with a kind of privacy. And this maybe reflects life before social media. when people could indeed live their lives with a greater measure of privacy instead of being surveilled on CCTV.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing the diaries.
I just want to say about the diaries that they are extraordinarily moving and sad as she confronts her malignancy and her anticipated death, as she deals with the loss of relationships. And in the late 1950s, everything seems to have blown apart. Ellen Ballon, at age 60, opts to marry a man. Ralph Gustafson, who's part of their triangle, marries a woman, Betty, a nurse in New York. And then the next year, Jacob Epstein dies. And the relationship between Kathleen Garman and Sally Ryan becomes more intense. Sally is spending more of her time living in England. She dies ultimately while in residence at the Dorchester Hotel in London, even though she's buried in New York. And all three of them, Ellen, Sally, and Ralph, fall into a kind of undeserved obscurity, given their artistic contributions and their fascinating lives. And that's what I'm hoping, in a modest way, to be able to restore with the book I'm writing.
That's amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. It's been brilliant to make your acquaintance, and
It's been a lot
help
of
us fill in
fun.
lots of the gaps. Yes, and
I'm so grateful to you and to Stephen at the gallery for easing the journey.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
All right. I'm sorry I joined late. I had a problem with my computer. I'll not bore you. I mean, absolutely fascinating, David. And we do get requests from people, as Julie knows, out of the blue. And often they lead down narrow paths and don't lead anywhere. But your pathway has been fantastic. And, you know, the information that we're able to share and all this new research will hopefully put Sally Ryan in a proper artistic place, you know, because she's still not as well known as she should be. And also, I hope I don't mind saying, but I've noticed on the participants, Cindy and Jesse, they're there if they want to say hello. Maybe not, no.
maybe shy. Maybe they can chat at the end.
Yeah.
But does anyone else have any questions for David? Feel free to pop them in the chat or to unmute yourself if you want to ask or comment at all. You're more than welcome.
I just wanted to say thank you very much. That was really fascinating and has stimulated me to do a lot more reading. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, because what you're talking about is in a way so personal to you, but also impacts in a much larger way. And it was a really fascinating journey that you've taken us on. So
there's much more to the story, but
I'm sure I'm looking forward
limited
to
by time.
If I could say, we live in Walsall, and we actually noticed, I did for the first time, the Somerset Maugham sculpture, or the plaster. I'd never noticed it before. And what I find fascinating is that there are so many things emerging about inanimate, animate objects from your story, and the whole sort of letters and personal family connections to it, that it really gives a tremendous hope in two ways. One is that further things will emerge and be found out about some of the lesser known, as with Le Martinique and Nathaniel and Valentina, the 5-foot Ukrainian designer with shoes in stone in Italy.
No, that was Aunt Ellen.
Oh, right. Sorry, I missed that. I think the other thing is there's tremendous scope, and I know the art gallery is doing quite a lot of work with writing organisations and bringing people into art, but trying to give people the chance to try and create the stories behind some of these figures and faces. I mean, a particular one that I've always enjoyed is T.S. Eliot, because he's there like a singular hawk, and it's moved at the moment, but you can walk around it. And it's just fantastic because kids can look up his nose and look into his eyes and think about the poems. So it's been fantastic. And you must, it's a whole new extension of your involvement with Sally Ryan. It must be marvelous.
Well, it's been a blast for me. And I have to say, you have a jewel of a gallery in Walsall. You should be very pleased and proud.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a nice message in the chat thanking Tim for the donation through Kathleen. So how far are you along with your biography, and when will we be able to have it for sale in our shop?
Yeah, I'll have to finish writing it before it actually goes on sale. But I've been writing various chapters of it, and you'll understand there's one principal chapter about Sally Ryan, and that was actually the chapter that I wrote first, because I knew, Julie, you had a hard deadline for me to give this talk. So the book is out of sequence, but it'll get back into sequence. And I'm hoping to have it done in the next 6 months or so. But I should point out, this Ellen Ballon, if I can take a moment, was a child prodigy of the piano who, by age 12, had already played concerti with orchestras in New York, had played her first White House recital for President Taft, and by the 1920s was presented at court to King George V, and is one of the few musicians who played for King George VIII. King Edward VIII during his brief reign. So she had quite a dazzling career in her own way, but it is completely in the dustbin of history at the moment.
And why do you think that is? And that's obviously why you want to write a biography.
Because I don't think she was in the first rank of great pianists. And it's a little like the Olympics, right? Nobody remembers who got the bronze and the silver. They remember who got the gold. And I think even Jerry Seinfeld defined the winner of the silver medal at the Olympics as being the person who, of all the losers in the world, you're the best. So, it's easy to get forgotten in that way. And she, thanks to Sally, didn't have to work that hard at generating revenue for a concert career. So that eased off the pressure on her as a performer.
Well, I think it's fantastic that you're not only kind of putting Ellen in the spotlight, but also Sally, two sort of unsung women that deserve to be much better recognised, and also their love story at a time. Yeah, and you can really get a sense of that as well with the excerpts from the diaries. And yeah, it was a very different time, and they weren't sort of able to be as open about the true nature of their relationship.
Right.
So yes, look, I cannot wait for the book to come out. So these are the books that you're best known for, though, which I think, you know, you're very well placed to be writing a biography. I think you can really get to the heart of these two women. So we look forward to the next Ellen Ballon biography. So yes, I think it's just to keep to time. I think we're officially sort of finishing, but if there's any last questions or any comments in the chat, please do speak now. And if you do want to have any questions or queries or feedback or any more information, there are my sort of contact details. But yeah, I'd just like to thank you so much, David, for your insight and your introduction to Ellen for me, and for all the additional information that you've been able to provide us to kind of fill in those gaps that we've had. And it's amazing to see more of her work, and that you are looking after it, and your family are enjoying it. And it's just been brilliant to put the pieces together. So thank you so, so much.
Well, Julie, thank you for the opportunity. And let me say to any members of the extended, and it is an extensive, Ryan family who may be on board, because I have written a fairly detailed Ryan family history, starting with the grandfather, I'd be happy to share that with you if you want to be in touch with me.
That's brilliant. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. And yes, have a lovely rest of your day and in Canada as well, David.